One of the most dangerous aspects of this isn't something that fails loudly. It's actually something that works just enough to get our trust and then quietly underperforms. And then you see this drift. And that, I think, is where we need to really focus our attention on.
In the first 5 to 8 years, I do see there'll be some big news headlines coming out about some clinical errors and misadministrations that are happened.
Welcome to AI in Healthcare. My name is Dr. Sanjay Juneja. I'm a hematologist medical oncologist, also known as the OncDoc on social and news media. And I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Deborah Patt, and you are listening to Tensor Black's AI in Healthcare. And when we're talking about that, especially in early 2026, we are talking about a plethora of things that we can only imagine we'll be seeing. Deborah, I am sure with your senior leadership role at Texas Oncology and everything you know just from your AI task force and all of the doings with COA, that this year is going to be a very big year for the things that are going to be kind of really thrown our way when it comes to AI tools and models and fancy, things, diagnostic, prognostic, and everything in between. So what do you make of it? And I'm sure there needs to be a vetting process to be able to really evaluate these things as they come at us so fast.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time, Sanjay, and that's why I'm excited to work with you and others and trying to help us sort of forge a path because, as you know too well, healthcare is always delayed in adopting change, especially with regards to digital transformation. And it's a time where having more rapid and safe and secure adoption is going to be really critical to create efficiencies for the healthcare climate that we really need to have for tomorrow's healthcare workforce. I think that people will fail to innovate at their peril, and we need to do it very carefully, safely, and securely. So it's a really critical time, and I think we're seeing that by all of the information out there about new changes and how people are using AI in healthcare.
100%. And that is precisely why you and I made this episode. Look, there isn't necessarily a ton of excitement and giddiness when it comes to, regulation and FDA approvals and all of the kind of, red tape kind of things when it comes to doing things responsibly. However, I can promise you, if there are two people that are the most fun and comedic and educated in this space, these two people are it. And that's who Deborah and I found for you. Number one is Dr. Lindsay Cotton. She's a clinician scientist in oncology, implementation science, and emerging diagnostics, whose work bridges research with real-world innovation. And Dr. Amar Rivari, who is a radiation oncologist, healthcare strategist, and health policy leader, active in national medical organizations and value-based care discussions, as well as also a podcast host. And what we're going to do today is really get an idea of the things that we need to think about and ask when we are vetting these AI tools and technologies, and whether it's AI or not, as they come to our table. What are some of the things we should, consider? What are some of the things that we need to ask and inquire about to be able to compare apples to apples, the reliability and safety of something? So that's what you're going to learn in less than 60 minutes today. So Lindsay and Amar, it's very good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Lindsay, my first question is for you. Can you please walk us through? I'm told, and you told me on our pre-call, that FDA approvals are very much a legitimate thing when it comes to AI, and it's actually nothing new. Can you explain that to us and give us maybe an example before AI models and platforms of what that means to have an FDA approval versus something that may not have an FDA approval but still be propped up in an institution?
Yeah, it's a lot of semantics here, but mostly there's a lot of really important aspects of this that it's important to understand and peel back the layers of. So I think that, one, I'll say that the FDA absolutely has been looking at AI and all that for a long, long time. Well before anyone here, Sanjay, started going gray, we were actually talking about all of these things. So like looking at modern diagnostics, AI, the way the FDA looks at it, and they've set something up. They have their own team that they started setting up back in 2019 to look at AI specifically. And so, but we from the research side have been using AI, and we call it machine learning for the longest time. We still call it machine learning, but now AI is more of a buzzword that we're hearing, but it hasn't really changed. So I think it's important to clear up some common misconceptions first. So when we look at how machine learning has been used, it's used in a lot of different ways, risk prediction, models, but a lot of it's been blood-based testing or looking at different assays and tests that we have in the hospitals. And so when people hear LDT and not FDA approved, they assume something is unregulated or unsafe. And I think that is a huge misconception that we need to debunk, like right out of the gates. It's not how the system works. So CLIA, which is something called the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments. So Congress passed the CLIA Act in 1988, which like no one cares about history, but this is actually all important for us to know this because we're writing these tests and prescribing them, right? So CLIA gave CMS the authority over clinical labs, not over devices sold on the market, but however labs operate and how their tests are performed inside of them. So under CLIA, these labs have to be certified, they have to meet quality standards, perform proficiency testing, validate the analytical performance that the tests run, all of those things. And that includes LDTs, or laboratory developed tests. And CLIA governs these laboratory operations. It does not provide an FDA-style pre-market review of these products. So for decades, the FDA has maintained that LDTs technically fall under its device authority, but it exercised what it's called enforcement discretion. And so in plain English, that essentially means the FDA said, we don't really want to deal with this. And we're not going to require pre-market review for these LDTs. Instead, we're going to have CLIA give them oversight. And it's not a loophole. It was an intentional policy to allow clinical innovation to happen because so many times clinical innovation gets stalled. I mean, you all know this. It takes 10 years at best for drugs to make it through and see the clinic once we figure it out in the lab, and 90% of those fail. So they didn't want to continue to withhold innovation, but this was a way that we could actually move innovation forward, help with diagnostics, and get it into the hands of clinicians so we can help our patients. And so what surprises clinicians the most is that LDTs, or lab developed tests, are something that we use all the time without even realizing it. So many tests now have some FDA clearance, but plenty of them are clinically essentially components of lab developed tests. And so like LDL testing, advanced lipid panels, thyroid tests, many cancer risk stratification tests like BRCA, all of those are LDTs. And so we're hearing this term now because the complexity of the tests have changed, but we've really been using them and order them in practice for decades. And so now that you have a little bit of a backstory, why this matters is because there are some that have FDA clearance or approval, and there are some that don't. And you can have an LDT, like the BRCA testing, for example, or the ones we order every day in hospitals that are well vetted. They're excellent tests. We trust them. And we don't think twice about them. But now, because the complexity is becoming more advanced with AI and machine learning and how we can develop these, that term is becoming more commonly heard. And when we hear it's not FDA approved, then we question like, well, why not? And it really comes down to one thing, which is access. So if we don't have access to, if we don't have FDA approval, typically we don't have insurance coverage. And without insurance coverage, you could have the best test in the world, but no one's going to have access to it and no one's going to be able to use it. And so while companies don't necessarily have to go through the FDA process, they often will go through it. And it's a long, rigorous process, but they go through it in order to get FDA clearance or FDA approval. So then as clinicians, we have access to it, knowing that when we order it on our patients, they're going to get coverage for it and we can actually use the test. And I think there's been a lot going back and forth. I don't know if anyone had heard, but in March of 2024, the FDA decided they wanted to change the game, and they said, oh no, we want to cover LDTs now, which started to make everyone panic. So all the LDTs would have to go back and do clinical trials. Long story short, just a few months ago, the FDA actually rescinded that. They're like, you know what? Never mind. Just kidding. We don't really want to have oversight of these tests anymore. It's way too much work. We're going to leave it in CLIA and CMS oversight. And and have them do their CAP accreditation, which is the College of American Pathologists. They also accredit these tests. So I guess I'll pause on that. That was very long-winded.
Well, it's interesting, Lindsay, because I think, we've seen nods from Dr. Macri that around technology as a medical device, that some of the FDA guidance is really evolving as well. I think it's been in an era where there is a lot of innovation and change. We've really observed a lot of leniency in how the FDA is thinking about what requires FDA approval and what doesn't. That really, if you have a medical device that doesn't have specific medical claims, it probably does not require FDA approval. So I think that's a real distinction of clarity that Dr. Macri is making in FDA's guidance that really helps us in this AI space and digital transformation, as many of us are trying to bring some of these tools and tests into the clinic.
100%. And that's very helpful because it can kind of help us appreciate also, AI tools that may be for patient care or things that are guideline based, but then perhaps another constellation of tools that doesn't require this kind of stringent FDA approval process. Or should it? I don't know. And that's why, Amar, we have you on here, because tell us what you think about, and I'm sure it's never, black and white, but what does that FDA process look like? What should they have to kind of deem, yes, this is okay, and everything that follows perhaps can be an LDT version of that? Or is it, and in addition, is it like the tool altogether as a point solution? Is it a platform? Is it a technology? What are they looking at exactly when it comes to AI and its use case in clinical workflow?
Yeah, so LDTs taught us an important lesson. When something isn't FDA approved, doesn't mean it's unsafe, right? It means the responsibility of validating and using and implementing that product falls back on the institution. And so I think a good example of one of these technologies is Artera AI. So it's something I use in my practice. So it's a tool that has both FDA as well as an LDT thing. So the software, I believe, was FDA approved, while the test came out through the LDT CLIA process. But
Amar, can you tell us a little bit about how Atera works?
Yeah. So what it's used is it's used to determine how we prescribe treatments for prostate cancer. So whether we are going to do active surveillance versus actual treatment, or if we're going to add hormone therapy to our radiation therapy. And so it's utilizing AI to give us risk scores based on the patient's pathological samples, and leveraging that to make treatment decisions. So it's a next layer of AI. So the way I look at AI, I look at it into like three buckets. There's kind of like the ones that assist you. So with, like, as a radiation oncologist, doing auto contours or treatment planning, I use AI that's baked into those systems, and so that has to go through an FDA regulatory process, like you said, Sanjay. But that's baked into the software, and so, for example, if we are doing something with auto contours, and it's like what they're approving for that approval doesn't necessarily transform into everything. So it's just for that auto contouring. So it doesn't mean, like, if you're doing something with creating treatment plans, if it's just because it works for one setting doesn't necessarily mean it'll work for others. So you have to validate it in your clinic and look over time, which is something the FDA can't do, right? They're just saying that it works, but you yourself have to look at that. Another bucket is what Artera AI is, which is more like influencing your decisions. So that's actually affecting your treatment algorithms. And I think for that, the bar should be higher than just for something that's baked into the software. And so whether that, I believe whether that goes through a more rigorous FDA process or whether LDT alone suffices, that's a really good question, because I think that is a higher bar. And then the highest bar is autonomous AI, where it's just making the decisions. And I think a good example of that is what was in the news just a few days ago in Utah, where they're using AI now to do automatic prescription refills for patients. And that's not having any clinician involvement whatsoever to verify it, right? That's just an automated process. So that's the highest bar. So I think depending on what level of of AI tools you're using, I think there should be a different regulatory process and different bars to achieve. And also how much you monitor it in your clinic after the FDA approval, because just because something's FDA approved, like I said, that's the pre-authorization process. But then the implementation of it really comes down to what you do in your clinic and see how it works in the system you've designed.
So tell me a little bit more about the decision making, because I will say I think that as clinicians, and I think we all are bleeding digital transformation in our organizations, and so we're all sort of in the same implementation bucket. We're pretty comfortable with clinical decision support, right? When the decisions lay in the hands of the clinician, and we understand very clearly the tools that we're using and how they're used to help us create architecture for the decisions that we and patients make together. But making a decision autonomously without the input of a clinician, talk to me about that. What's your comfort level there? Do you think that's okay with some prescriptions, all prescriptions? Can you tell us more about what happened in Utah?
Yeah, so I mean, I just read the same news articles everybody, since I don't practice there. But yeah, my comfort level with it is very low, because I do believe, and I think this is the big barrier to implementing AI on a broad scale for these type of autonomous decisions, is I think most clinicians, similar to me, are going to have a low barrier, a high barrier of entry, because we have a low trust in the technology, right? Until we see it's been validated and can do it without clinician oversight, I just am very wary about using it without any clinician oversight, because the liability is still there. So that's the thing. The liability doesn't go away just because something's become autonomous. The liability is just shifted, but it's still there on all of us.
I will say, and aside from the moral challenges, right, of having someone other than a clinician and a patient making decisions, it's a regulatory issue also, right? Because there are many federal and state laws that govern how clinical decisions are made and the use of AI in those scenarios. And I think we're seeing those pop up both at the federal and state level. And there's some divergence at the state level in some of those policies. And also how you think about consent for some of those policies, and there's a lot of state variability there. Like in Texas, where I live, as of January 1st, we have to disclose if AI is being used, even things like to answer the phone for things like the revenue cycle team. And AI is not being used for things like clinical decision making. But there's a lot of variability state by state. And so I don't know what the law is in Utah, but that to me crosses a line. I'm curious, Lindsay, how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I have the same concerns as everyone else has. There's a line that we have to be really careful on where we cross. I think when it comes to patients and what they know, I mean, I'm sure you guys all remember, and I think most people know that during COVID, we had to suspend HIPAA for a long time just because we had to move so fast and we didn't have telehealth set up. And so we were communicating with patients on WhatsApp and all these different things. And you had to talk to your patients about, hey, just want to let you know this isn't secure. We don't know what's happening with your data. And a lot of times the patient just, in my experience, they would, am I talking to you or am I talking to someone else? And I'm like, well, you're going to be communicating with me and the team, and they're fine with it. So it's just having that open transparency and dialogue with them, which is important. But I think, the way that I look at it too, when we're building out these models, and I know that the way that, the conversations I've had with the FDA is the question will come back to whatever it is that we're building, whether it's a tool to improve things like patient workflow, prescriptions, for example, or an assay to understand, do we proceed with something or do we not, is it comes down to, did it improve decision-making for the physician? Did it improve the patient's outcomes? And then did it perform reliably in real-world use? And I think that's a really exciting thing that's now we're shifting towards, that these advancements have started coming forward. It's actually not new that FDA looks at real-world use and real-world evidence. They've actually looked at it for a long time. It's usually just post-market analysis. But now they're open to proactively looking at it and accepting this real world application, because we all know that the perfect scenario and the perfect patient in a clinical trial does not translate to real world use. And I don't care if it's a medication or if it's something that we develop with AI, it doesn't translate. And we need to understand real world applicability. And I think that's the part that we need to get towards is, yes, there's a lot of risk involved with this, but as we use it and apply it to the real world, how do we actually take that information and put it in a way that we can transform it and make sure that it's done appropriately and safely for patients?
I love that you brought that up, and I need to disclaim that this is my opinion only and not reflective of any of my affiliations or titles. But when I heard that, I was like, this is just potentially going to really blow the lid off of, especially the concept of precision care and delivery, because you're talking about real world evidence that has all the confounders and says, yes, bring all the confounders, just have it in there. And now go to town with your machine learning or your algorithms or whatever else. And I just want to believe that with the kind of machine learning, deep machine learning, what have you, multimodal, approach of being able to normalize all of this data and have it translated, that we could potentially see so many, different shades of blue or green, so to speak, of how things can be nuanced between different populations. I think it can really accelerate potentially the things to investigate. On the same note, I had to look this up going into this podcast. Clinical decision support tools, some of them require understanding the context of the patient chart. So when we say unstructured data usually means the stuff that's not discrete. So it's not like, in a table in Epic that you can click and have a value for. It's actually scanned in to the media tab, which we all hate, or something that is not, again, just a discrete element. However, AI today can read unstructured data. Now, that process or the evaluation of how well it does it is called abstraction. So when you're looking at AI and how well is its abstraction, you're assessing, is it getting it right, this unstructured stuff? As I understand it, the FDA, when they're approving, say a model that you'll prop up inside your EMR or your institution, they're looking to make sure it's safe. They're looking to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. But there's no way for them to call or say, hey, the abstraction is correct. That's kind of on you, either on you as an institution or on you as the vendor who's providing this. And that assumes a level of responsibility to make sure this works that I think is a little different than approving, a fake knee, not a fake knee, a prosthetic to be able to put it into the knee, or something that cauterizes during surgery. Like there's a whole nother element to ensuring, other than putting it in. I guess one could argue that's still a an on-site approach. But how do you all feel about that? Do you think it's going to cause trouble? Do you find that this is kind of in line with how we're used to seeing approvals in general, and that there's always this aspect of kind of vetting and interrogating it locally? Love to hear your thoughts.
I think it will evolve over time. I think that early in, one, I think using real world evidence is incredibly helpful in getting approvals more efficiently and decreasing the cost of investigations, right? So, and getting us faster. Like that's, palbociclib for men with advanced breast cancer is a great example, using real world evidence to get that approval for a study you could have never accrued to. So I think that that's really helpful. But because our data sources historically have not been used as data sources, there are going to be errors. And some of those errors will be perpetuated in AI systems that incorporate them for downstream functionalities that will bias the results in critical ways. And so I suspect what we will see is that this will evolve over time, because we need our health records to evolve to not just be billing systems with reasonable data. They really need to be anchors of accuracy, of exactly what they're quantifying, because some of the data that they get will be perpetuated in other models. Like, for example, when I see a patient, if I diagnose them to have a clinical T2N0 breast cancer, and so that's in my note, but then they have a surgery and they T3N2A breast cancer, if I didn't change my note appropriately, their benefit from subsequent therapies would likely be underestimated. And so I think that we have to recognize that the tools are no longer documentation and billing software, that we have to evolve how we are documenting to make those tools more accurate. And I suspect that in the next few years, that's likely to happen. I'm curious what Amar and Lindsay think.
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys are saying. The idea of using real world evidence obviously will lower the barrier to innovation and having things come in. But like you said, Sanjay, it really is going to require a lot of monitoring in the real world, which requires investment on the part of institutions, right? And so that's my worry. You know how slow hospital systems are to do anything and change. I mean, look at how long it's taken us to move with EMRs in this country and interoperability. And so now we're talking about having individual institutions invest in substantial resources to monitor what's coming out of these AI systems and look at the clinical impacts, because the regulators aren't going to be able to do that, and the vendors aren't going to be able to do that. And so, but how do these hospital systems know how to monitor that? They don't. This is all new for everybody, and so that's my only worry. Whether in that process there could be some significant errors and clinical errors made that particularly may affect vulnerable populations, because of the data that's coming in may not account for that disparities in care for different populations. So that's one of my worries, and only time will tell, and we'll learn from the mistakes of big systems that maybe have errors, and then everybody else will learn from it. But in the first 5 to 8 years, I do see there'll be some big news headlines coming out about some clinical errors and misadministrations that are happened.
Yeah, I think we've already seen some examples of that. I don't know if not to call out any companies, so I'll let them remain nameless, but there were some companies that were using AI and then bringing on telehealth and then having people call patients, and they were actually giving them all the wrong results, and they were cancer outcomes. So absolutely, there's going to be hiccups within this process. I think one of the exciting things for when I think of it with EHR is like a dumpster. I mean, obviously we know there's so many issues with it, especially Sanjay, you mentioned discrete fields. That takes so much time from people to go and do that data extraction. And that's one of the huge bulks of money that it takes to even run these clinical trials. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to my friends at different academic institutes who are like, I don't have the staff to help me pull the data I need in order to participate in this trial, but I have all the patients that are here. And so you have so much opportunity that goes to waste because of something as simple as data extraction from an EMR. And what we're seeing now is that, for these studies, as an example, we use these CRAs, or clinical research associates. They're needed in these studies to find all the information, find out who's eligible, ask these questions. But now what we're able to do is deploy these AI programs that can actually sweep through the EHR and even find if there's a clarification on, it says that they had an allergic reaction to this here, but it doesn't say it here. They can actually narrow in, find those two things, and then bring them forward for the CRA or someone to then resolve it. And you still need that human clinical decision making and that authority, but you're able to then cut down the, clerical work by someone that can be using their strategic thinking elsewhere, and then make the entire process more seamless and still ensure that there is, analysis methods done, that there's data governance that remains critical. But I think we can use it as such an amazing tool to improve our ability to get clinical trials done, bring clinical trials to more rural areas. So I completely agree. I think innovation, often we like to believe that innovation is going to get to the rural communities and we can help disparities. It typically doesn't happen. It usually broadens the gap. But in situations like this, I do see us in the next few years seeing this type of innovation bringing wider breadth to who can participate in clinical trials. And we can get and reach those more rural communities by getting tools like AI to help be that extended arm of a CRA that to a rural community that could never afford to have a CRA there. And we can start enrolling these patients that we need to be represented in these clinical trials.
I think for many things, like, as we see, we try to bring in innovation and virtual services to have a greater reach to rural communities. This is a great place where, to your point, you could have an AI tool do screening for clinical trials, right? Then you could have a virtual CRA say, okay, the AI tool has screened and identified a potential patient. I still need to double check and make sure that, this is clinical decision support. We need to make sure that this patient is really eligible. And then you can bring it to a clinician to think about enrolling that patient in a clinical trial. And it could really disrupt clinical trials with improving accruals, reducing the costs, reducing the time it takes to accrue patients in incredibly favorable ways. And it won't be perfect. I'm sure it will get better over time, like all things with AI have. But as a clinical decision support mechanism, it allows our people to work more efficiently and allows us to bring more services to more humans.
100%. And, we chose Umar on purpose. One, because of his charm, and two, because I love his, he has this kind of very important speculation. And to his point, you have this aid that comes with these AI tools, but there's an undefined framework, an undefined frequency of how much you're supposed to check these models, an undefined process, of okay, what sample size do I need to be able to make sure it's functioning correctly? One example I'm going to give you, if this isn't making sense, is recalibrating your lab machine, right? So when you have a CBC or you're checking sodium and whatever, there is a frequency, a specified frequency you're supposed to recalibrate to make sure that it's accurate compared to a control. And every now and then, in one of the hospitals I worked, they knew I wanted to be the person that calibrated because I got free labs. So, but it's defined. And that was relatively easy as I understand it. I don't know. But imagine that for these AI tools now. Now you need to recalibrate. And to do that, you need to check, is it still performing the same way it was 2 weeks ago? Is it actually still as accurate for that cohort? There's something called domain adaptation, where sometimes when you get a model off the shelf, you need to actually change the domain a little bit just for it to get exactly as accurate as it came off the shelf based on your population, your ordering behavior, etc. So all of this governance, one other term being drift. AI models can have what's called drift, which means they're just all of a sudden not doing what they're usually doing. And I experienced this in the craziest way. I was writing a children's book on explaining and handling cancer, and it was very simple. It was like, these are the illustrations. Let's go ahead and put with the character limitations that I wrote into which bubble they need to be. And it was doing it, and I was cruising, and all of a sudden it just stopped listening to me on the bubbles of the character limitations and started being crazy. And I was like, what's happening? Like, why? It drifted. It went away from its set parameters and doing it beautifully to all of a sudden not. And I had to start over. These things happen. And that's where, when you're talking about the populations that need it most, understaffed, like most saturated, that's my concern, is you may almost see this paradoxical, decrease of benefit to the rural areas because they don't have the internal means to be able to vet these processes. So I don't know. I see you smirking there.
You hit the nail on the head. That's exactly, you obviously phrased it much more eloquently since you're the AI expert. Drift is exactly, like, if you keep putting the same prompt in ChatGPT again and again and again and again, it inevitably changes the answers, and it keeps changing it and changing it and changing it. But in clinical practice, those little changes compound. And as in radiation oncology, like you said, I'm trained that we are constantly auditing our machines, right? Physicists are doing daily checks, weekly checks, monthly checks, yearly checks on the linear accelerator, making sure that our beam doesn't drift more than a millimeter in essence after each treatment. And we have to recalibrate that machine. AI is exactly like that. And that is my worry, not to sound like the, sky is falling person, because I am excited for everything you brought up, Lindsay. And I do see the potential there, but I just worry about the investment that's going to need to be made to make sure that it is accurate and it's not drifting and creating some issues.
AI and diagnostics, I think the question isn't, does it work once? It's easy to prove that. And a lot of companies prove that, and then they publish something and they run with it. But does it work when the world changes? Because when we see it in our clinical setting and then use it in real world, it's going to change. And the model, as we've all learned from using ChatGPT and everything else, it's very similar in these other medical contexts, which it's only good on the data it was trained on and the patients it was not trained on, which is just as important. And I have a lot of optimism in this space, but I also have a lot of hesitancy and questions still, which is, I think, in my experience, I've learned that one of the most dangerous aspects of this isn't something that fails loudly. It's actually something that works just enough to get our trust and then quietly underperforms. And then you see this drift. And that, I think, is where we need to really focus our attention on, is the ones that are working enough to get our trust, but then we see that drift. And, small point percentages don't look huge when you're just looking them at once on paper, but when you really do the math ain't mathing. We're missing a lot of patients and a lot of things can go wrong. And when we use the tools as clinician, the consequences are then on us.
Yeah,
And so there is a lot of reasons to have hesitancy.
and I think diagnostic imaging is a great analogy, like you brought up, because if you're using tools to, let's say, triage for strokes or for other things, timing is of the essence, right? So if they're saying something, if the system all of a sudden doesn't recognize something being as critical, that timing to the triage is going to obviously make a huge difference in clinical impacts. Also, as clinicians start using a tool for more and more purposes, let's say something was used to identify lung nodules, and now all of a sudden you're expanding it to looking at liver lesions. Those kind of different clinical applications, as people are not vetting them carefully, that's also another area I worry about. So I think diagnostic radiology is a great example of where there's potential opportunities, but also a lot of danger.
To that same point, I had, I'm going to sound a little ignorant on the way I phrase this question, but I was watching a Netflix documentary once, so let me just start with that. And they were talking about how, you have this concept of the FDA approvals that are approved based on the condition that they're similar to something that was approved formally. One, what is that called? Forgive me that escapes me. And two, is that applied now to these AI tools? Like Lindsay, you had said some people will piggyback this, one point in time kind of statistic. I'm afraid we might see this advent of that, where it's like, oh, we're under that same umbrella, and we somehow just kind of got ushered in just because we were, coming in the same horse carriage that somebody that was invited was able to attend.
Yeah, I think, Amar, I'm interested in your perspective on this, but usually it's, for my wheelhouse, it's called the predicate device or the predicate test or the predicate drug. And so and that's also kind of a nuance between something being FDA cleared and FDA approved. So FDA cleared is we're looking at something where FDA says, yeah, it works, but it doesn't mean that there's going to be a clinical impact or there's clinical utility. It just, yes, it works. And and they don't really look at like the safety and harm and all that. FDA approved is where you have to do a full clinical trial and you have to understand it and you have to submit all that evidence to the FDA. And then they say, yes, you have enough utility and harm and all that stuff has been established, or lack of harm. And I think for the way that a lot of the space works right now is, for us to get access, you need to not only have FDA approval, but then you get on guidelines. And FDA approval is actually, it's a hard bar to get, right? But the harder bar is getting into guidelines. And once you get into guidelines, let's say they have a test. I'll use colorectal cancer screening as an analogy. So the FIT test came out and they had their certain performance characteristics and like 70, specificity and sensitivity, or like 74, 80, something like that. And any test that came after that to look for colorectal cancer screening that wasn't a colonoscopy, so whether it's a blood test or a stool-based test, they had to meet or exceed that performance characteristic. So the bar was set arguably maybe a little low, and then any other test just has to meet that or exceed it. And they don't necessarily have to go through all of the rigor that the other ones do, but they do have to meet quite a few of those metrics. And so that's one aspect of it. And then if they go down getting the like the MolDX route, that's the same thing. You have to have a predicate device. The one caveat with that, and I'm not going to sit and claim to be a MolDX expert, but I will say what I know is that you if there's something else already on the market that does a similar thing, it's the same thing. You need to meet superiority, like you have to meet it or exceed it. And once there's already something out there, you don't have to prove again clinical utility most of the time. And so you actually, these companies or people developing these different tools actually save by not being having a first mover advantage. You actually can save your company by like being an add-on, but just being a little bit better.
Yeah, I think I'm curious from Lindsay and Amar, as you all are leaders of how we think about implementation in different fields of cancer care. It occurs to me that change is hard, and having done this for a long time, leading digital transformation at my organization, I thought the hard questions were which tools to use, and now it's clear to me that implementation and change management are the hardest things that we do. How do we create an ecosystem to facilitate the appropriate change that's necessary in medicine, which is so reticent to change? Obviously, you guys do this every day. How do we, as an oncology community, evolve better?
I mean, I think one of the barriers to adoption, right, is going to be, or let me rephrase that. Adoption follows incentives, right? So I think if you're in the C-suite of a hospital system, what are you thinking about? You're thinking about length of stay. You're thinking about your quality metrics. You're going to be thinking about your denials, right? That's what gets these C-suite thinking, because that's how you're compensated for your care. And the things you're disincentivized by is investing in a product that maybe is going to be obsolete in a few years, that's not going to integrate so well in your other systems. And so some of the things with AI I worry about in oncology specifically, like we have a lot of vendors for radiation oncology, I'm sure for medical oncology, that are specific AI tools for radiation oncology clinics, like that help with our efficiency and workflow, and reduce documentation and help patients like with throughput. And there are a lot of companies in that space. But when I even had a meeting yesterday with the C-suite of my hospital and inquired about that, they were like, no, we're an Epic-focused organization. We've been burned in the past about, investing in A+ item. We'd rather go with a B+ item that's broadly accepted across the system rather than an A+ item for each individual thing. And so that is where I think if AI vendors or if you as an individual are trying to pitch a product to your hospital system for adoption, I think framing it in terms of what they're incentivized about, as opposed to looking at this like, oh my God, it's going to be another financial barrier for them with integration. And that's where I worry it may be a longer uptake, even though the tools are great, because hospital CEOs and CFOs are just reluctant because they've been burned in the past.
Well, I think that it's clear for all of us to advocate for change that we need to demonstrate return on investment. Like there's obviously, in order to get a C-suite sign off, that has to happen. But without people like ourselves to stand at the intersection and say, okay, things like patient education translates into return on investment because you're having patients have better outcomes. They're calling the clinic less. You can have less nurses to answer questions, or by implementing this tool, which will likely iterate to other tools, you get to have fewer radiologists that have better work-life balance. That's better for you. Like there have to be people to articulate that value proposition, I think, in order to have organizations choose to change.
Yeah. And I think one other point to that is retention, right? There's a lot of issues around workforce hiring nowadays, right? And retention and physician burnout. And I think as time goes on, most physicians or other providers are going to not choose to work in a system that does not provide them AI tools that make their life easier and they can go home to their families. Why would they stay for 3 hours of doing burdensome documentation? So I think as the hospital systems need to realize that, they're going to be competing against their peers for that same limited workforce. And so, if they want to retain their existing workforce, they really should be looking at these investments in AI.
I was going to say, the only thing I would add on to the question about the way that you're talking about implementation science, you can have the best tool that will improve patient outcomes, physician work-life balance, and everything else. But if it isn't integrated the right way, it will never be used. And so we can have the best things die on a shelf because no one knows how to properly implement them. And then back to what Amar said, which is that they have to be incentivized to use it. And the last few years, I've really have been diving in deep with different health systems trying to improve their cancer screening rates. And one of the things that I've noticed is that we've got HEDIS measures for all these different things in medicine, and we have them for colorectal cancer screening and breast cancer screening. And yet the number one cancer killer that we have is lung cancer. It kills more than, prostate, breast, colorectal cancers combined. Lung cancer screening remains extremely low. We're at like 5%.
Abysmal throughout the country.
Horrible,
Yes.
right? And so, but the systems are failing by not identifying the patients who need to be screened. Part of that is the dumpster fire we talked about of EHRs. Like, how do we find the patient? It might be listed in discrete fields, so when you do a search, it's not pulling up. But the other part is that when you go to the C-suite and you want to talk to them about it, it's just not necessarily been a priority. And then there's a lot of organizations like the National Lung Cancer Screening Roundtable and others that are trying to do work to get HEDIS measures to come out for lung cancer. And the hope is that when there is that incentive for the healthcare system and there's onus on them to do better at these things, they'll bring in the tools that we need in order to improve these basic things like lung cancer screening, identifying the patients. How do we get an AI program in that's going to be able to review the discrete fields and identify these patients? We know that there's algorithms that we can put into these EHRs and pull the patients out, regardless of them having a smoking history or not documented in their wellness visit. They can pull it from all different things where they can look at other aspects of their chart and with 95+% confidence be able to say, you don't have this patient listed as being eligible, but they probably are. And then all of a sudden we have someone with a list of hundreds of patients that should be getting screened that we can make a huge impact in such a short duration of time. And so until there is that incentive and there is that need, I think we're going to still be fighting against these systems. But implementation science is the most important part.
I would love to ask you all, if you'll have time in closing, one thing, and I'll start to give you a second because it's on the spot, that is your prediction for what 2026 will bring. If 2025 was the year of, I don't know, scribes and AI, like what is one tech or AI thing that you suspect could happen? And if I had to guess, and I was thinking it literally only just now, so forgive me, but I think that with the popularity of wearables and wearable data, Oura Rings and Apple Watches and whatever, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some institution somewhere that is incorporating in some objective way some piece of that data, be it sleep architecture, be it your cardiac acceleration for a certain physical labor, whatever the case may be. I could see that being a real sticker of an article to say, hey, incorporation of continuous monitoring to help guide possible decision or diagnostic making.
I will throw out that I think and I hope and pray that and I'm a simple woman, Sanjay, so it's all about staffing for me, recognizing that it takes too long to get scans read. And we have staffing shortages throughout radiation oncology, imaging nationally. It's a shortage and it's not going to get better. So I hope that imaging centers rapidly adopt AI for two things. One, clinical decision support of reads, not to remove the radiologist, but to make it faster for the radiologist to do their job. And two, to optimize scheduling with centralized scheduling services, because I feel like sometimes when we have barriers in patients getting the right tests that they need, like lung cancer screening, because we're not using AI for scheduling modalities, we aren't optimizing the utilization of the capacity that's available across the country, and there are easy improvements there. So I think those are quick wins. I think they're safe wins. I feel like there's a lot of other stuff that will be done that's a little bit more controversial, probably needs a little more time in vetting. So in my mind, it's all about staffing, and I would like to see improvements in imaging.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it's going to be around the messaging back to patients from my chart, because right now, our inboxes are full. Patients, I'll see a patient in a consult or on my weekly treatment visit. They have no questions, and then throughout the night at 2 a.m. The next morning, I look at my thing at 6, 7 a.m. and I see them messaging me at 2 a.m. when they're anxious in the middle of the night. And so I think AI is going to be responding back to those messages more and more. And, it should be framed for patients. It all depends on how it's communicated to the patients to ensure trust. It should be framed as decision support, that this tool adds information, but your clinician is ultimately responsible for your care. But I think that would really help physicians with, burnout and help patients get the feedback they want faster.
I'm excited for that moment to happen because I do see that coming as well. Sandy, I will say the first clinical trial that I ever worked on designing back in 2016, 2017, we actually used like Dexcom continuous glucose monitors on our patients to understand if they would have a spike after receiving steroids. So we started doing that type of stuff years ago, but no one ever really talked about it. And it wasn't even an interesting point that we discussed in our results. But now thinking, I'm like, you mentioning that, I'm like, we've been doing it for a while. No one just talked about it. I do think that's going to get bigger. I think that something funny that we'll have to deal with that might be challenging as clinicians is that ChatGPT is so smart, and patients are using it now to replace clinicians. And that could be a blessing or a curse. We might see a reduction in unnecessary urgent care visits or ER visits because, I don't know if you've ever tried putting anything into ChatGPT, like a complex health issue, and it will spit out like really reasonable things. And it'll say like, no need to be concerned about this. And this is when you should call your physician. And I've not yet seen it wrong. I'm sure it, again, drift. It could totally happen. It could go outside the bubble. But I do think it's doing a really good job so having patients understand they could use it as a tool, not as a replacement, but a complement to their healthcare team, I think will be a really interesting thing that happens this next year. I think we're going to see advances of it. I think we're going to hear some crazy stories about how like ChatGPT saved people's lives or something like that instead of their doctors. So I think if I had a magic 8 ball, I think that's probably what we'd see in the next year.
I'm going to build on Lindsay a little bit and give an example and a word of caution as we enter into this next year. Because I was just reading today about the settlement between Google and Character AI around the teen suicides because of a chat bot that they were chatting with. I think the mental health space is really tough, and it's tough because there's such a desperate need. Because as a nation, we're really underserved in mental health services. And so there's a desperate need, but, AI can't do everything. In my opinion, there's probably good boundaries around triage and lower risk things, like guidance around cognitive behavioral therapy for lower risk folks and to triage acuity. But I think that there's going to be trouble and a little more trouble in the mental health space until we figure that out. And we'll give that as a teaser because, again, it was announced today that there was a settlement between Google and Character AI and some of these families that had teen suicides. I think some of them also introduced age limitations on use. But I think that next week's episode is on mental health. So a little teaser for our next week.
Love it. And thank you all for your time. Y'all can find them online. They have a great social media presence, and we will see you all in the next episode.
Thank you.